while we're getting settled, we can probably, we have a message from our sponsor, Glass Tire. So we'll go ahead and run that in just a little bit, and then we'll get rolling. I'll explain the evening and we'll get started. Okay, thank you to Glass Tire. We appreciate their support as always. And to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm Terry Thornton, Curator of Education at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. Welcome to being there Tuesday evenings at the Modern, Tuesday evenings with the Modern, the museum's online alternative to the long-running lecture series Tuesday evenings at the Modern. Each week for this special program, a guest curator, someone who has participated in the Tuesday evening program in the past, invites someone within the art world who they find compelling to give that evening's presentation. This is followed by a Q&A, which is generated by you. So as the presentation proceeds, you can type your questions by accessing the Zoom's Q&A tab that's down at the bottom. And in the end, the speaker will entertain as many questions as time allows. So tonight's guest curator is the artist Alejandro Cesarco, who has participated in Tuesday evenings twice now due to my personal fondness of him and his work. I appreciate Alejandro accepting my proposal for tonight's format, and I especially appreciate him for his invitation to the brilliant and industrious Kandis Williams, who Alejandro will now introduce.
Thanks, Terry, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you especially to Kandis for accepting my invitation to join us this evening. Kandis is an artist, writer, editor, publisher, and educator. And like my own practice, hers is one that takes on a number of different roles. I first came across the work of her press, Cassandra Press, in the zine tent at Printed Matter's New York Art Book Fair in 2017 or 18, I can't quite remember. I'm particularly interested in Kandis's practice as it pertains to the question of access. Through Cassandra Press, which she co-founded in 2016, I think she works towards furthering a more equitable form of access, of perhaps rethinking what we understand by the term access itself. I see Kandis's practice as thinking through notions of the archive, of representing or making present again, or insisting on the presence of a body of knowledge or experience, but also creating an archive in itself through both her artwork, her publishing, and teaching. I'm also interested in how Kandis rearticulates notions of collage through publishing and editing. In this way, I would like to pull aspects of her practice together to think about how her work with collage as an artist relates to her work as an editor and publisher. Both forms pull together fractured fragments in more or less unfitting ways. the collection of readers compiled by Cassandra Press distribute photocopied, scanned text on topics such as labor after Reconstruction, the school-to-prison pipeline, misogynoir, and others that I'm sure she'll touch upon later tonight. Among other things, collage and editing point to the impossibility of completeness, the impossibility of wholeness, not only as it concerns knowledge, but also, and perhaps most importantly, as it concerns identity formation. The series of online classrooms offered by the press, I think, continues a long tradition of artist-led educational programs, and it employs particular teaching philosophies and practices, including the occasional segregation of students according to race, and offers studies in areas such as ontology versus the ontic, whiteness, dissonance, horror, etc. It is my pleasure now to hand it over to Kandis, and I very much look forward to her presentation this evening.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I guess we can start with the first slide. Okay, so I'm just gonna let the coffee sink in a little bit. Thanks for the really great introduction, Alejandro. So I will just kind of start. So thinking about the press and the classrooms of 2020 that have just sort of started, starting in the spring and summer. I just want to kind of talk about Cassandra and the myth of Cassandra and how I relate it to his first access, and then to my collage practice, and then sort of to the greater classrooms, how we're thinking about integrating like an awareness of sort of the poetics of genocide and the poetics of regimes of evisceration and logics of evisceration into a De Silva concept of, you know, a Black feminist poethical. And then also thinking through affective governance and sort of the importance of, you know, becoming more aware as spectator, consumer, scholar, theorist of a lot of new terrains of historicity, the importance of sort of being educated and training pedagogical tools and perceptual tools. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of just start with thinking about Cassandra. So I relate Cassandra a lot to, oh yeah, and I would really, you know, we're gonna kind of just keep this talk brief and then hopefully there's a lot more questions from the audience. I think that's a more dynamic Zoom lifestyle. Yeah, so thinking about Cassandra in terms of the myth of Cassandra. So Cassandra was a goddess who, and a prophetess who was gifted with prophecy, but then cursed with deniability, so with incredibility. And I relate Cassandra very much to the sort of hermeneutic enclosure that Black feminists, and especially Black femme, and this is like cis and trans Black femmes, have to sort of deal with in terms of becoming bodies or sites of knowledge in and of ourselves. So yeah, thinking about the sort of various forms of enclosure in terms of abstraction, degradation, denigration of sort of credibility, our narratives essentially, and how they're hidden sort of from us and embedded into sort of fetishistic narrativizations of Black femininity and caricature. I think a lot of my collage deals with, with eroticism, with sort of exotic, erotic, libidinal economies, and with violence, especially in terms of like the construction of like social formations and sort of like social scripts. So I think through choreographies in terms of bodies moving, but then also bodies moving and forced to move and sort of forced to migrate in certain ways. So definitely also still relating to Cassandra, this idea of prophecy through sort of forced movements or through movements that are sort of that have intentions and sort of intuitions that are non-languaged, but that are sort of created through the friction or the movement of sites of knowledge and concealment. Yeah, so we can move to the next slide. Thinking about this Dylan Rodriguez essay really started a lot of the transformation around the readers into full-fledged classrooms. So definitely in terms of knowledge that I think is really important to impart right now, especially in terms of tools of perception, I feel like there's a lot of what Rodriguez talks about is the regime of evisceration or logics of evisceration that tend to distort or transgress or sort of manipulate and mutilate the bodies of colonial subjects and especially marginal bodies, and how these kinds of poetics create in themselves almost like centrifuges to both accommodate and to constantly react or resist genocidal regimes, I think is very important to sort of like build language around. So thinking about affective governance and then thinking about, sort of white supremacist politics, not sort of, but definitely thinking about white supremacist politics and the importance of understanding how propaganda images, propagandistic images and also artistic images both explore and exploit these lived categories. So Rodriguez says within such regimes of evisceration, principally racial colonial conquests and racial chattel social formations, the lived categories and abstracted classifications of gender and sexuality are subjected to distortion, transgression, and manipulation or mutilation as a matter of the infrastructural emergence of the gender genocidal regimes themselves. And I think that is to say that as sort of genocidal regimes roll out, they also roll out images and representations of subjects that are being destroyed or eviscerated as whatever sort of anchors in the cultural imaginary they need to facilitate said violence. So we can move to the next slide. The class I teach is on whiteness, dissonance, and horror. And definitely thinking about dissonance and sort of the white cultural imaginary around the horror film as one of those places where a white cultural imaginary is really calibrating and reacting to almost doubling itself in order to see the sort of victim consequences played out in a cultural fiction or a cultural imaginary. The genre of horror sort of acts as such a discipline where the actual colonial atrocities and violences visited upon colonial subjects and indigenous and Black subjects are essentially reiterated as fantasy throughout the modern. So we look at, the genre of horror from 1850 on, from the end of the colonial, birth of the modern on to today, and sort of think about how whiteness structures itself as a normalizing gaze, but also as a paternalistic monster. We think about white psychopathy and how white psychopathy is also coded into normative behaviors and militaristic structures. We can go to the next slide. Thinking about sort of medical theaters and the dissection, mutilation, inherent of so many of various bodies and the corpse economies created around those bodies. The sort of medical theater and the perpetuation of scientific cures that rest on the perpetual creation of new medical subjects and, agential and non-agential medical subjects. So thinking about life and non-life, various forms of non-living beings that also are up for various kinds of dissection, and how those categorizations of non-life then double as the citizen as marginal citizens' bodies. So we're thinking through whiteness as it sort of abstracts social formations in order to produce things like sadomasochism as propositions of utopia, or violence is sort of inherent in, like almost Freudian psychoanalytic notions that are built out of these same medical amphitheaters that then suggest, poetic kind of ends or an annihilation, evisceration as a poetic vehicle. We can go to the next slide. Thinking about especially the sort of white cultural imaginary that then perpetuates as much terror as it kind of like understands itself to be at potential threat, and sort of that doubling of white hysteria and white rage that sort of like mask violent perpetrative acts. We look at the modern until sort of Vietnam and various kinds of media, various kinds of explorations of filmic explorations of a kind of an interrogation of that power dynamic, especially the power dynamic of self and other. So this is a slide from The Winter Soldier. The last slide was a slide from an 1890 medical theater in Roxbury in Boston. This slide is from a scene in The Winter Soldier, which is a 1970s movie about it's a sort of tribunal, a self-staged tribunal from from survivors or from soldiers of the Vietnam War who sort of hold themselves accountable for crimes against humanity. And it's interesting again here to see, whiteness and then also dissonance. So dissonance around sort of white supremacist logics that, different bodies interact with or enact or are in proximity to. This is a Native American Indigenous man and a Black man were also part of those tribunals, and sort of the discussion around race and sex and gender and class also in terms of the perpetuation of essentially violences that are white supremacist violences that are carried out globally by non-white American citizens. I think this is a really interesting examination of dissonance. We also look at Philip Zimbardo and Leon Fetzinger and their dissonance experiments at the Stanford prison experiments and the dissonance experiments of the 1970s, 50s. We can do the next slide. It's in the next slide. This is Zimbardo. After, I guess people probably know this, but about 20 years after the prison experiments, he started this thing called the hero training. So thinking about, the monster and the hero, or what the sort of qualities or characteristics of mythic herodom, and the will to sort of act in one's best self. Again, these sort of dissonances and propositions around white figuration of power dynamics, like the prison guard dynamic that the prison experiment takes, and then sort of the affective, the constant sort of like whiteness making this constant discovery out of the affective governance of violence, and how sort of like violence becomes this new white cultural imaginary space, sort of intergenerationally, is really important to that class. We can go to the next slide. And yeah, so thinking again about how, violence and sort of like, especially the ability to terrorize or create terror, systems of terror and advantageous proximity to systems of terror interact with white subjectivity. We segregate our classes, or some of the classes have been segregated in Cassandra classrooms. So my whiteness, dissonance, and horror class is segregated along, right now, along lines of appearing white or not, because we deal with the flesh and with gore, and especially with the penetration of the flesh. So I do that in order to protect my Black students from a cultural imaginary that sees their own flesh as constantly punctured, constantly voided, a superficial surface. And and so that those students don't have to confront or become basically the accessible informants for other students to sort of negotiate these discursive terms for the first time. So to sort of shield them from a white cultural imaginary as well, or being analyzed in a white cultural imaginary that sort of doesn't understand their hermeneutic enclosure or the lived experience that ends up charging a lot more advanced awareness of especially sort of genocidal, the maintenance of terrorism and genocidal regimes, I'll say. So we can go, this slide is Rhea Dillon's class is also segregated. This is Rhea's reader. Rhea's reader includes includes videos from Howardina Pindell, Joseph Khalil Joseph, Black News, and Tony Coates, and to name a few contributors to the reader. And we actually distribute this reader to the class, and we ask that class actually to segregate themselves again along socioeconomic, more socioeconomic racial constructs. So we ask them to understand if they've had parentage or advantageous parentage, so white or European parentage, and that's whether or not that's informed their space of production, and for them to self-segregate based on those terms, so that we can really understand. Rhea's prompts are like sort of two sets of questions, 3 questions in 2 sets that are that come out of a will to understand, or to sort of also research and cite, I think, in her own practice, gather data, gather information on certain propositions that I think become convoluted linguistically between ontic and ontological, so between the real and the kind of discursive elements that represent the real. So she's asking for people to sort of like segregate themselves along their means of production, and then answer these questions that she has for certain realms of cultural production. And there it's important that, people identify first as cultural producers and then understand their ability to produce in terms of racial and socioeconomic constructs. And so there's 3 totally different sets of questions. And so, yeah, we can go to the next slide. Manuel's classes, a class that I'm just super thrilled to have had as our first class, their alternative history of abstraction, 101, hopefully one of many. And, hopefully, in further iterations of Cassandra Press, we'll have more classes from Manuel and Ria and other scholars coming up soon. But Manuel's class really looks at abstraction and thinks about the Black body in terms of figuration from the Crusades really on through modernity, focusing on Black scholars and Black scholarship, especially. I think this class is just a real gem. We can go to the next slide. Manuel also teaches their own project called Homeschool and is a poet. And I really feel like a lot of the Cassandra stuff too, and the issue of sort of poetics and what poetics can govern is a lot of the focus too around the press in terms of Black bodies, Black figuration, Black abstraction, really sort of like tersing out these ways in which Black bodies are phenomenologically given a lot of space to affect governance, and then also having, especially genocidal regimes or logics that carry that affect be simultaneously stripping Black bodies of the ability to live, or rights to live, or means to live. So yeah, we're kind of in that nexus in the last slide. Which is why I'm also really thrilled to have Ebony's for Black students only, which are Black students only based sessions that deal with sort of like the emotional labor, excessive emotional labor, and restrictions around participating in the art world as a Black person. Ebony is somebody who's like consistently and constantly sort of encountering the market with a lot of innovation and I think generosity in terms of her situating of Black artists from emerging to larger markets. And yeah, really super happy to have that space be, dedicated to Black students who are in art school or in practice, and having them also be sort of aware and have a safe space, basically, or a space that, I don't like the term safe space, but having a space where they can share, share vital information and practical information, as well as sort of, emotional information about what they're going through and how to move forward. And yeah, that's kind of where I want to end, is that we're pushing forward. Hopefully there's going to be more, not hopefully, definitely there are going to be more classes. We're contacting teachers now. We're rolling out classes for hopefully a winter course and a few symposiums through the fall. We're going to launch our Encyclopedia of Blackness and Abstraction, and that's 3 volumes on Blackness and annexation, Blackness in the image, and Blackness in the archive that have, at this point, around 300 texts. We basically have to stop editing and print. But that's coming up soon. Yeah. And a kid's imprint is also in the works. So thinking about, what we owe to the future in terms of ethics and poetic ethical space. So fusing aesthetics and ethics and trying to sort of create content that makes, future generations also aware of historical context and how to navigate historical context versus, again, these acts of concealment. Yeah, so ready for questions, I think, or for an interact. Cool.
That was,
John.
That was amazing, as suspected it would be. So now we're ready for the Q&A, and you've given everybody a whole lot to think about. So I think it might take people a few minutes to form their questions. And yeah.
I could start with one if no one
Perfect.
has. Okay. Thanks very much, Kandis. That was a lot and super interesting and great. I was just wondering if...
Oh, John, can we go back to the first slide? Sorry, I don't want to
I was just wondering, I've never taken one of these classes, and if you could kind of tell us or describe how they model all of these many concepts that you've kind of addressed, and if the class structure itself is already a way of teaching, or like how do these concepts get enacted in the classroom, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I guess Zoom is really, I think Zoom and a lot of the online learning and online like meeting platforms have sort of facilitated this a little bit easier than physical space would, obviously. So yeah, it's been nice, having our classes hosted on like a variety, honestly, of platforms, and being able to just sort of ask people, how they identify, and then ask them to, join certain rooms or join certain conversations. That's been that's like kind of, that's the how of it. I think the dynamic also starts off, the dynamic actually sort of started for the whiteness, dissonance, and horror class, like, the dynamic is there, essentially. Like Black students and I think Black scholars and Black teachers end up, always sort of editing what they say or editing a lot of information and a lot of sort of reference and experience in order to be, have more objective claims, I think, in classroom spaces. And so, especially because of when we started during this George Floyd uprising, there was just a lot less tolerance for that in Black students, I think, and in the space of having a Black teacher, I think, in Black scholarship being a leading force in Cassandra, it really did become necessary, I think, as a platform that was doing what it wanted to do, like what it said it was going to do. And in terms of creating space that protected, or that not even protected, but that alleviated that dynamic of Black students becoming, incredible and performative resources for non-Black students. Especially in conversations about ethics and in conversations about sort of the lived experience or understood experience of living or existing in terroristic or genocidal regimes, or regimes of like police brutality. So this class started off too looking at a lot of, and horror, right? Like thinking about the sensory, the realm of the senses. We looked at Laura Marx. We look at a lot of, from, ways of seeing by Berger to like, other phenomenological or perceptual Western thinkers, and thinking about why horror is effective, has so much to do with the real life terror enacted by so many regimes, and then also covered and concealed through effective political propaganda. So it was, in this moment of coming together without a campus or without an application process, or, like we basically were like, do you want to talk about this? Come join, and asking people to organize themselves and their politics before they got into the classroom through a curriculum and through a reader. So one thing that we do when we start the classes is say, like, look, this isn't therapy, it's a course. So we ask all of the students to keep referring back to the text so that we aren't, we aren't doing things that we can't do, right? We're not providing therapeutic space where we want to have a conversation about, phenomenology or something. So we do a lot of sort of self-governing in that way. And also I listen to the students, and I feel like in that first whiteness, dissonance, and horror class, it was just very apparent. I have to give a shout out, to those first students, that first pod of core group of kids, or kids, they're like grown ass people. But that first group of people who really gave me the space to be like, what's fitting and what's not. And, where is this going and how is this feeling to be like, because I think for the Black students, they're getting language, but where they have an abundance of experience. And for white students, the cultural imaginary is a space where they have very little experience actually in terms of peril, danger, fear, horror. The very safe white, like, kind of citizen experiences very little of those outside of this mythic realm of the monsters of the modern that are, supposedly waiting. So it was this kind of, very incongruous thing that became very clear, I think, in the first classes. And then now I'm just sort of putting together materials for a class that I'm going to launch in about a month that I think is going to be a Black student only class, which is Blackness, Dissonance, and Terror. So then thinking about what Blackness takes from the mythical monstrosity, the mythical monster, the mythical mythical evil in terms of our kind of collective dissonance. And I, you know, as a teacher, I don't even want to start that class in integrated space. So I want to start that class in Black space, and then hopefully in the next iteration of it, integrate. Once I have a thesis from, you know, my informed students, my specialist students.
Yeah, that's great. That was exactly what I was going to ask is how do you see this developing in terms of broadening the segregated class, and is there room for that, or is that, but you answered that. So I will ask the question that has been posed here by one of our participants. How many students are typically in a class? In the classrooms, do people's self-identifications change or shift? That's the question.
I guess, well, the first class was very small, so that was like about 8 people. The second class was a lot bigger, so maybe around 20, almost 30 people. And then that would shift a little bit. It depends actually on how we kind of register and recruit people. Ebony's classes are massive. You know, she just sort of takes as many people as she can within a certain time. I think Manuel's class was also pretty large, maybe around 14 students. Yeah, so it varies. It really runs the gamut. And then how people identify throughout the course, I don't really police. If people, you know, like, so sort of the questions of biraciality that come up, Cassandra doesn't, I don't think we're interested actually in sort of policing how people would want to move through those questions. I think it's just sort of up to people to, you know, ethically navigate as they want. So sort of, you know, my class for the whiteness, dissonance, and horror class, we segregate for the group discussions, and they all get the same lecture, you know? So I've had definitely students who identify or disidentify switching throughout groups. And that's not something I like. I sort of keep track of, as students need me to keep track of it. Like if they have interest or questions or, you know, want that even exposure, I don't think I would police that even for my Black students if they wanted to join various groups. Yeah. It really happens very, very organically once the proposition is like, which is a bit scary, obviously, in America, but it happens quite organically. And I do think the students get a lot from, I do think they get a lot from it, like a real exposure. For a lot of the white students, it's the first time they understand themselves as a white subject first in a space. And that, I think, I don't even know how that impacts them, but I do think that's impactful in ways I can't project.
Do you get feedback from those students though? I mean, the interactions, do they inform that?
Yeah, we do. We get a lot of positive feedback. Of course, like even the negative feedback or the feedback that's, you know, we just get a lot of thoughtful feedback, honestly. It's been very, very positive in that way. I think people take this kind of our classes seriously, which is something I encourage, you know, like we've had a lot of very dedicated students with a lot of very different questions for the research and for the courses, and I'm super happy with that. And we've also had students from so many different backgrounds, and yeah, and I'm really happy to kind of have a space that can like start talking about those backgrounds and their imperatives and their intentions, and, you know, bring some sort of affective understanding of, you know, a lot of the rhetoric we use around diversity without abusing it, you know, and sort of like also that training in that way, I think is important. Training language in that way.
Absolutely. There, I was, I'm looking through my notes because I'm trying to remember what exactly you were giving a talk, I think, the Coventry University, and you mentioned the concept of non-othering versus diversity, non-othering spaces. Is that some of the language you're talking about, like the difference between that and diversity?
Yeah. I think spaces that, again, I mean, even we were thinking in terms of prerequisites, you know, for the next semester. I feel so much how different the dynamic is in our Black students, and spaces that we provide for Black students, you know, only that there's just so much exhaustion, I think, from being really tapped, you know, like for a lot of emotional labor and for a lot of affective, again, forms of affective governance and reasoning that have no stability or protection really for those bodies, infrastructure for those bodies to be supported. So sort of, I like this, I like this way of sort of going about it for now. To sort of like think about how to not other, but to accept, you know, a lot of the difference that is weighing on people and that is actually governing people's decisions and rationalizations, the ability to rationalize violences that are happening in real time. Oof.
Yeah.
Oof. Sorry, I think I jumped. I thought the computer just died. I was like, oh no.
You can't hold that on us.
That would happen, yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. People are starting to form their questions and work up their nerve, I guess. How did pedagogy develop in your artistic practice or as a form of your practice? Is it where you began or where you have come to?
I guess it's like kind of both. So I started teaching right out of college or right before college ended in after-school art programs in New York, and I ended up sort of running a nonprofit organization right as I graduated art school, which was, you know, such a sort of thankless ordeal for a Black person in 2008. It just felt so crazy. I think to graduate from, I went to Cooper Union. It's like a very prideless day or something. But I do remember recuperating a lot of energy after art school by teaching art and really kind of like, I think about it as like art with a big A and art with a little a. And teaching after art school kind of gave me art back, you know, like kind of art school made me understand art with a big A, like this massive racist, sexist, classist, unregulated industry that basically, you know, helps float so many other genocidal logics and literal industries. You know, it's like the art in the hold with the gold and the slaves and the oil. I don't know. So just like sort of like art is like national currency, nationalistic currency, propagandistic tool or whatever. And then, art with a little a, which is just like healing. And so how so many different people find comfort, healing, beauty, intergenerational communication, and, you know, lineage, legacy, like how people represent experience itself. And that art with a little a was really given back to me in some of the classrooms after college. So I got to teach in East Texas, as I told you, and then I got to teach in New Orleans. I got to teach in Baltimore. I got to teach all, you know, younger children, and seeing children and young people with material and being able to, like, you know, transubstantiate, really turn value into material, turn their emotions into substance. And that really just gave me art back, I guess. And I think I continued in whatever idea of being a professional artist seriously after that teaching experience ended. And I kind of co-directed, I ran that company for about 5 years after college. And so Cassandra just got 501c3 status. So I'm actually looking forward to doing it again, like as an adult.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question. First of all, thank you. This is Janine Dreskin. She says, thank you for your incredible and generous talk, Kandis. Could you please speak a bit to the idea of collage that Alejandro brought up that can be said to analogize, your editorial pedagogical practice and your visual art practice?
Yeah, for sure. Collage, geez. I mean, I'm sitting in a room with like collage stuff now. I guess I just started to sort of think in this way now. I guess I'll reference like Bracha Ettinger's Matrix Border Space. I think that text really cemented collage brain for me, that I have like a collage brain. But yeah, just that, you know, that like subjectivities don't just meet, that they meet, you know, and that there's this whole space in between where we meet, where there's like an interstitial, this hugely interstitial, this is like Spiller's, you know, interstitial space where we become really porous, kind of like porously connected to each other. And thinking about, you know, even intersectionality and extending that into the matrixial border space, it's like a matrix is like no less than 9 points. So yeah, thinking about like connectivity and like, you know, like really trying to like use not nuance, let's say, and not non-objective or objective intentionally, any kind of material, but just thinking about how we can, in more interstitial ways, sort of connect or trans subjectivities, create sort of trans subjectivities, like how other and I interact, become more of a, so that I and other become more of a space. I don't know, that's a spirally way of explaining collage, but I do feel like, you know, the art historical space that a Black body participates in and like, and can produce culture from is inherently this kind of collage space where like, you know, my lineages to different ideologies are constantly questioned or made suspect by the racial construct. My understanding of certain constructs, of even the racialized construct, is then, you know, further, and this is all that hermeneutic enclosure, undercut by my positioning as a raced body, you know, like, so there's just all these different ways where it's also kind of, it's a weaponizing mind, it's a pattern-seeking mind, it's a, you know, it's a mentally ill mind too. Like, it's like collage is really the way for me of understanding how many different layers of intentionality, of intuition, of propaganda, of maybe healing, are all tangled and swirled inside of, you know, an image. So for my early collage practice, I really was like trying to deconstruct photographic content, like, or liquidate. It stays in my mind, but a real point of the, you know, Xeroxing a million pictures, or like, you know, not a million, but, you know, creating like wall-sized geometries or mandala kind of images out of like sets of research points, was about liquidating the photographic. Like, so like really taking whatever could be recognized affectively from a photograph and turning it into like a blur, or turning it into a full form or an abstract form.
That's amazing.
So yeah, so that's just kind of been, that was like the beginning of, or that's like, yeah, that was also this kind of work that I was doing in school. Yeah, and the readers tend to try to do that around similar themes. So like have a kaleidoscope of different perspectives, like an interstitial amount of perspectives, really enlivening that mix of that space of I and other and subject and gaze or something.
I was wondering if you could kind of speak some more about collage, and I was wondering if there's like a triangulation that happens between collage and this word healing that you keep using, and what happens in the, like, the pedagogical construct of the classroom. And I wonder if there's like some kind of constellation or some kind of something that's happening in between those three words.
I think for sure, I can talk about like the choreography. Like, I think choreography and this idea of like the social script, or social formations and sort of social choreographies and social scripts. Yeah, that also becomes a kind of collage space. And I guess in terms of pedagogy, like that, it's all like, you know, I never conceived, I think, of physical space for the Cassandra classrooms, which is interesting. Like, I don't think even like back in January, we did this show on the Printed Matter show, and the 3 like kind of new readers for that were so informative of where we are now with the classes in the press, and also sort of like larger culturally. So I did a reader on the Chitlin Circuit, a reader on two-dimensional design, and sort of like, you know, very much in line with Manuel's class on the Black figure and Black figuration and primitivism and the birth of primitivism and design complexes or constructs. And yeah, and then a reader on Blackness, minstrelsy, and cannibalism. So that kind of also became the whiteness, dissonance, and horror class in a big way. But yeah, the dynamics between like collage, performative, scripted elements, pedagogy, I think it still does that thing where It's like, what is the Black body in public space, and how many different hermeneutic enclosures am I subject to, and how can I get away from them, and how can I weaponize some of them? How can I sort of protect myself as a body of knowledge? How can I project myself as a body of knowledge? How can I redact myself as a body of, or a site of knowledge for others, you know? So yeah, I think there is definitely, you know, I think in thinking about how to organize my own school, or organize my own courses, organize my own curriculum, organize anything from a magazine to a newspaper, a piece of printed matter, something that leaves a trace. It starts with the organization of my own kind of internal architecture, and then it goes outward. And I think also fusing ethics and aesthetics is like, it's that kind of accordion for me. So that Cassandra is essentially a finger of, like a collage vein of my practice, essentially. And I think the experiences that I'm collecting around orchestrating classes become around, like they're actually, it's kind of a realm of performance in a toolbox or something. It becomes in the realm of performative toolboxes, whether, whether for like the Cassandra classes or not. And it's also becoming, you know, it's helping me become more aware in another way of again, social choreography and social formations around my body and bodies that look like me. So it's informing still a greater and a newer part of my collage practice, which is definitely choreography and building choreography.
Okay, the questions are pouring in now. So thank you, this first question. Thank you for sharing your generous talk, and also your experience with art with a big A, art with a little a. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on history and history making, and how this may relate to myth, truth, etc.
Oh, well. History making. If this is one of my students, I'm gonna.
Not agenda. I can't.
I will talk there just about the class. I'm teaching a class right now, actually, for Cal Arts, in Cal Arts, that's really nice. It's a speech and debate class. So there again, you know, in the classroom, I ask the students to, we're only reading a few books, but I really like the selection. So we're reading Plato's Gorgias, Aristotle's Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, Algorithms of Oppression by Safi Noble, and Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. And this Tikkun text called This Is Not a Program. So I really like this kind of like situating of like the new kind of conversation around algorithms and like deductive versus co-rational or correlational forms of like knowledge seeking and knowledge sites. And then, you know, throwing in, you know, the very, I mean, I think as Alejandro said in our meeting before, like almost origin stories of how we argue and how we distinguish what an argument is from an opinion, or how a bias is distinguished from an opinion, how you know, logical fallacies and rhetorical fallacies really do, you know, automate a lot of our affective reasoning is one thing that we're really looking at in the class. And so this concept of truth as like almost like a psychic structure, the class is called Veritas. Truth is like this goddess who's very interesting, kind of also, she's like, she lives in the bottom of a well in one Roman myth, and another she's baked in the same kiln as falsehood. So falsehood and truth are, you know, sculptures fired in kind of a Pygmalion story in the same kiln. They look exactly alike, except for falsehood doesn't have feet. So yeah, thinking about truth and how we construct arguments, how we construct rhetorical, what we understand to be like, you know, automated phenomenon, which is logic, right? That the sun comes up, the sun goes down, burst logic that we sort of automate, or that we sort of build a narrative around as human beings. Yeah, and really looking at sort of like, you know, racial, especially, the classes are on the art world, so we're looking at kind of like, you know, famous quotes, like famous art world iterations, basically. I'll pull up some of those. Stuff like Elegance is Elimination by Balenciaga, or Yvonne Rainer's Facts Are Feelings, or God is in the Details by Mies van der Rohe. So we're sort of looking at and interrogating those statements of truth, or those statements of you know, subjective truth, and from different art sources, or art making, or art cultural production sources, and really asking, you know, I'm asking students to debate the resolves of those arguments. And yeah, and I think truth is also a space. Truth is a space that we ultimately have to share at whatever risk that produces. But I don't think there's not a truth. It's not really like, yeah, it's a space or a structure of interpretation.
Wow. Does collage help you, help us dissolve, obscure, break down categories on their boundaries, or does it make them more apparent?
I think it can do both. I think it's a question of like, or there are many questions in collage. There's like questions of repetition, of composition, and this is my Bauhaus education really showing. I think there's also, ways where the Bauhaus collage is so informed by a lot of like indigenous cosmologies from like, Marcuse's kind of interest in African familial cosmology and how that kind of shines through in constellation therapy, like things like that, like Schwitter's and, his interest in field recordings of the Kalahari to like, so there's a lot of like kind of like ways where I think the modern and its rupture with like European kind of classicism, and that modern, like it makes it so that a lot of the primitivists become these sort of hybrid sites of knowledge that aren't purely or strictly European or something. And yeah, definitely. So thinking about collage and, what photo montage is, like what it is to be a subject in a photographic regime, what it is to be a subject in like, so many different scopic regimes that are, on top of racial constructs. I feel like it's a way of almost like way of thinking and kind of like, yeah, like it's embodied or something.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
No, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about something that you were hinting at, which is the relationship between collage and technology. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's something that's of interest to you. There seems to be also like a very specific use of technology in the distribution of the readers, and also now with Zoom. But I wonder if there is some kind of like a...
yeah, collage and technology for sure. I mean, I think collage and technology, it's that matrixial thing, I think, as well, where it's like, the photograph produces the painting as fallible. And then, like so many different kinds of technologies on top, that are produced via the photograph, then produce the photograph as fallible. And so I think in terms of that, conversation of truth and what's transmitting truth or transmitting, signaling truth or signaling true expression, which is another genocidal, like I think a logic of evisceration. Like in the class I teach genius and genocide really simultaneously, so that this idea of an aerial of, the intentions of all others is essentially, I think, is born out of like capitalist monopoly theory and how that kind of trickles down into like, affective force and interpersonal affective force. And I think technology does that. And like with collage, there's ways where certain, I feel like that it's maybe it's too causally sloppy to say or whatever, but that, new forms of technology produce collage out of time itself, and out of, our means of representing any given moment. Just the evaluation of a photograph of a daguerreotype now produces another level of interpolation or something. So like from, I don't know, but technologies. Blackness also produces its own sort of technology of communication that I think also lends to rationalization through multifaceted, I don't know, sort of like a more multifaceted subjectivity. I don't think we get the privilege of being historically coherent as subjects, as lived subjects. Our lived experience doesn't have necessarily, a lot of historical coherence. So I think there is a lot of space where Blackness as a technology is about, picking these pieces of coherence out of history and then really, the act of resisting a lot of the internalization of ahistoriosity comes from each individual interpretation of that kind of like loss and collage of the aspects of humanity that can be vehicularized, you know, into survival or protection or legacy. Or I guess that's why I keep mentioning something like healing, because I do feel like art is one of those primary spaces where recuperation of every aspect of the human can exist. But again, we don't have a lot of systems of interpolation or interpretation or analysis that don't simply re-enclose that for the Black subject. That's still work in progress.
Very hopeful. Okay, here's a question. Does a school whose agenda doesn't involve assigning a credential attract a much more serious, quote, student? Cassandra classes are very appealing to me, but I would be afraid of showing up and not being able to complete assignments, or would miss a reading and be worthless.
Oh, well, don't fear that. I keep thinking about, I don't know. Education is like, how are we educating ourselves around, you know, textbooks written with white supremacist agendas? You know, like we all have this huge hole in terms of what we expect from the pedagogical exchange in that transaction or something of accreditation or credential for some sort of objective or canonized knowledge. Like it is so preposterous. Like I think I tell all the students to learn at their own pace, you know, that we hope that what we're giving them is another angle, you know, and a perceptual tool, another notch on that matrix to see the world through. You know, there isn't a multiple choice exam that's gonna like come back and fail you or something. You know, it is really just, I feel so grateful, you know, for so many of my students, because they come into the classes, you know, really just with their own curiosity and with an openness to engaging in the material from, you know, scholars that haven't been given space also. You know what I mean? I think as much anxiety as our students would feel about having, you know, being bad students, like it's not like I'm out here, you know, at white institutions feeling hella respected, you know what I mean? Or like showing up and like, you know, I've been fired from every art handling job I've ever gotten. Like, you know, we make up a really small percentage of people in educational space and scholarly space, you know, because of punitive advances on our bodies made all the time and microaggressions that limit our capacity in spaces. So I feel you, you know, it is hard to like, it's really hard, but definitely I think for me, Cassandra is a place where that isn't, we don't do grades, we don't do accreditation, we don't do, and I think our students bring their curiosity, and that's like first and foremost, and they bring like a respect for other students and a respect for, you know, relating to our curriculums. And that's it, you know, like we're not trying to create more screen time or more, you know, more deadlines or more sharp edges or something like that. And in terms of like investment in your own knowledge and your own creativity, like it should just be what you get out of it, hopefully, if you ever take a class.
So if people go to Cassandra Press, they can see the classes and they can see how to register for the classes. They can see what the stipulations for taking the class are, et cetera.
Yeah, and we're doing some site renovation probably like this week and next week. So we won't have the new classes up for about 3 weeks. Okay. But we will have 2 new readers and this encyclopedia. So we'll have the readers from our last semester available to download for self-learning. And then we'll have this encyclopedia available in some open lectures throughout the fall until winter classes open up. But come winter, yeah, people can find a registration page, and we'll probably be doing also promoting through Instagram and other magazines and stuff.
Okay, that's something to be on the lookout for. And if people have questions and they think that it's easier to get hold of me, then I can try to put them in contact. Otherwise, it seems like it's pretty available online. Okay, so we're going to end with this question from Wendy, which is a great ending type question. Who are the writers you gravitate towards, or the writers that reappear across the readers, either literally or through influence?
Wow, yeah, okay. There's a short list for them. There's definitely a bunch of writers that appear across readers. There would be Horton Spillers, W.B. Du Bois, Jean-François Léotard, people who take hits. Freud takes a bunch of hits in the readers, so there's a lot of the critique of Freud, a lot of critique of Jung. Raka Ettinger is in a lot of the readers, a lot of critique of, actually there's De Silva shows up a lot. I think Eva Luce shows up kind of surprisingly a lot. Wittgenstein shows up a couple times. Akil Mbebe shows up a few times. There's definitely, yeah, those are probably the short list. Calvin Warren shows up a bunch. That's probably the short list of people who are like often repeating.
It's an impressive list. Has me very curious. Okay, I think we're going to close. We have Khalil Irving, who says, thank you so much, Kandis, and that he looks forward to the next program. And I'll just throw in a plug that Khalil is the October 27th presentation, the artist. Oh, cool. Yeah, very cool. So Kandis, that was beautiful. Alejandro, I am forever indebted for this. Thank you to everyone. We will hopefully see you next week. I don't know, John, you want to put up the slide for next week? Are we still on? There we go. Okay. Next week promises to be amazing. So I hope you come back and bring a friend. And everybody have a great week. Thanks.
Thanks, Kandis.
Thank you, guys.